They heard the doubts whispered behind closed doors. Not capable, not ready, not equal to the task of commanding fighter aircraft in combat. Yet above the scorched cities of Europe, these men would shatter the most advanced machines the Third Reich could throw at them, rewriting history one mission at a time. German aviators received the briefings with amusement. America was deploying Negro pilots to the European theater, men who, in their minds, lacked the intelligence, the reflexes, the warrior spirit required for aerial combat. In mess halls across occupied territory, Luftwaffe aces shared jokes about what they viewed as easy victories waiting to happen. These same men would soon discover just how catastrophically wrong their assumptions were. Transport yourself to the opening months of 1944. Europe had been consumed by warfare for nearly half a decade. Rubble filled the streets of once magnificent cities, reduced to ash by waves of bombers. The Allied push through Italy had gained momentum, but the price in blood was staggering. From bases scattered across the Italian countryside, the American 15th Air Force launched marathon raids deep into the heart of Axis territory, targeting refineries in Austria, factories in Hungary, and the industrial centers of Germany itself. Every sortie meant countless hours in cramped cockpits, exposed to sub-zero temperatures, hunted by enemy interceptors and ground fire alike. Bomber crews developed a grim saying among themselves: complete 25 runs and you might see home again. Most never reached that number. For these vulnerable, heavy bombers, effective fighter protection meant everything. When the 332nd Fighter Group arrived on Italian soil in spring 1944, they carried a burden unlike any other unit. This all-Negro squadron, products of the training program at Tuskegee, faced skepticism not just from their adversaries, but from their own military. White commanders questioned their abilities. Fellow Americans treated them as a social experiment, destined for failure. But the aviators who would become known as the Red Tails had no interest in debates or proclamations. Their answer would be delivered where it mattered most, in combat. Consider Ramitelli Airfield, positioned along the Adriatic shoreline. Nothing about it suggested glory. Unpaved landing strips, temporary shelters made of canvas, and ocean winds that cut through the encampment with bitter cold. Yet this became home for the pilots and support personnel. Each P-51 Mustang, sleek and powerful, bore a distinctive crimson marking on its tail assembly. Initially, that red paint seemed like a target, a way for critics to identify and dismiss them. Within months, that same red would become a symbol of hope, something bomber crews searched for anxiously, breathing easier when those distinctive tails appeared in formation. During those initial weeks, tension hung thick in the air. Numerous bomber squadrons refused to trust them. Some officers explicitly requested different escorts, unwilling to place their lives in the hands of Negro pilots. Prejudice didn't respect military boundaries. But the 332nd maintained unwavering discipline, instilled by Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., a man who demanded absolute professionalism, precision, and gave critics no ammunition for their doubts. His directives were absolutely clear. The Red Tails would not pursue individual glory. They would not abandon the bombers they were assigned to protect. Their singular mission was safeguarding those massive, lumbering aircraft regardless of the personal cost. This philosophy distinguished them from other escort formations. When German fighters materialized, other groups sometimes broke formation, chasing enemy aircraft to build personal kill counts. The Red Tails didn't. They maintained position with the bombers, even when it meant sacrificing opportunities for individual victories. In the brutal calculus of aerial warfare over Europe, this loyalty would become their defining characteristic. But in those early briefings, German pilots sneered at the prospect of engaging Negro airmen. They viewed them as the weakest element in the Allied aerial force. Raised on propaganda about racial superiority, indoctrinated from childhood with notions of a master race, they considered facing Tuskegee pilots nothing more than sport. The arrogance was palpable, the contempt vocal. They couldn't imagine the humiliation waiting for them in the clouds above Fortress Europe. To grasp the magnitude of what was about to unfold, you need to experience it through the eyes of those bomber crews. Picture yourself wedged inside a B-17 Flying Fortress, cramped into a freezing metal tube. The engines create a deafening roar. The smell of burning oil and perspiration fills your nostrils. You peer through the window and spot formations of German interceptors slicing through the cloud cover, diving toward your squadron. Your gunners return fire, but you understand the mathematics. German fighters were lightning fast, expertly flown, and routinely decimated bomber formations. Then, in the distance, you notice sleek Mustangs bearing crimson tails sliding into protective formation, wings steady, maintaining tight discipline. They don't abandon your position. They don't scatter. And gradually, mission after mission, you come to a realization that these men are not the liability others claimed. They are your survival. The mockery from Luftwaffe briefings would soon evaporate. For now, though, the stage was prepared. A group of aviators underestimated by virtually everyone was about to carve their legacy into the European skies through determination, bravery, and a discipline that no amount of ridicule could diminish. Before the Red Tails could silence their enemies, they had to prove themselves under the brutal Alabama sun, far from any battlefield, where the struggle against bigotry was as fierce as any aerial engagement. Before their names were spoken with respect across Europe, the Tuskegee aviators were simply young men fighting for recognition in their own country. Their battleground wasn't yet the skies above Germany, but the training grounds of Alabama, where prejudice and skepticism weighed heavier than any flight equipment. Tuskegee Airfield sat deep in the segregated South, a place where summer heat was suffocating and Jim Crow laws were rigidly enforced. The facility was constructed as part of a compromise. Those in authority wanted to demonstrate that Negro pilots would fail, that they lacked the discipline, aptitude, or mental capacity to master complex combat aircraft. Yet this same installation became the birthplace of something remarkable. The cadets who reported for training were far from ordinary. Many held college degrees, some specialized in engineering or advanced mathematics. They came from urban centers like Chicago, Cleveland, and New York, and from small towns scattered across the nation. What united them was resolve. Each man understood that his success or failure would be judged not merely as individual performance, but as representative of his entire race. The pressure was crushing. From day one, the training was merciless. Instructors shouted commands, drills consumed every hour from sunrise to sunset, and any error could result in dismissal from the program. The military had countless excuses to eliminate Negro cadets, so standards at Tuskegee were not merely high, they were frequently unforgiving. As one instructor told a group of recruits, "You don't have the privilege of mistakes. If you stumble, they'll use it as evidence you don't belong here." Yet the men persevered. They mastered the PT-17 Stearman, a biplane that rattled and shook but taught fundamental aviation skills. They advanced to more sophisticated aircraft, perfecting maneuvers, navigation, and formation flying. The Alabama sun beat down mercilessly on the runways. Dust coated their uniforms, but they refused to surrender. In letters home, they described the endless days, the relentless drills, and the fierce pride that came with controlling an aircraft bearing U.S. Army insignia. One cadet later remembered the moment he first flew solo. "The earth dropped away beneath me, and for the first time I wasn't merely a passenger. I was in command." For men who had lived under laws that denied them equal rights on the ground, the sky offered a kind of freedom they had never experienced. But prejudice followed them even here. Surrounding towns were openly hostile. Negro officers were forced to use segregated facilities, and even their uniforms couldn't protect them from discrimination. In one notorious incident, Negro officers who attempted to enter a whites-only officers' club were arrested. The message was unmistakable. Regardless of how crisp their salutes or how perfect their formations, many were waiting for them to fail. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who would become their commanding officer, understood this better than anyone. A West Point graduate, Davis had endured 4 years at the Academy, where classmates refused to speak to him except for official duties. That silent treatment could have destroyed a weaker individual. For Davis, it forged unbreakable resolve. At Tuskegee, he carried himself with that same discipline and demanded it from every cadet. You will not argue with prejudice. You will outfly it, outfight it, and outlast it. Day by day, the cadets transformed into pilots. They practiced gunnery, learning to align targets and fire in controlled bursts, conserving precious ammunition. They mastered formation flying, wingtip to wing, trusting each other with their lives.
They studied maps and meteorological patterns, knowing that mastering navigation mistakes could be as lethal as enemy fire.
What distinguished them wasn't only skill, but brotherhood. Each man understood he carried more than his own future. If one failed, critics would say, "See, they can't do it." But if they succeeded, they could alter history. That shared burden forged them into something stronger than prejudice. By graduation, the Tuskegee Airmen were more than pilots. They were symbols. They had survived training designed to eliminate them. They had learned to master aviation while being told at every turn they didn't belong. Their reward wasn't just their wings, but the opportunity to fight in a war where every mission would test whether America's experiment in equality was genuine or just another broken promise. The men departed Alabama with pride, but also with questions. Would their own country trust them? Would the bomber crews they were sworn to protect welcome them? Or would the battle against racism follow them across the ocean, even into the war zone? Once they arrived in Italy, the reality of combat would replace speculation. And the Red Tails would face not only enemy fire, but the skeptical stares of their own comrades. By early 1944, the European war had settled into a brutal rhythm. Allied bombers struck deep into German-controlled territory almost daily, and the Luftwaffe fought desperately to defend the Reich. Into this inferno, the 332nd Fighter Group arrived, disembarking from transport vessels onto the rocky Italian coastline before proceeding to Ramatelli Airfield. Ramatelli wasn't impressive. Positioned near the Adriatic, it consisted of little more than dirt runways carved from farmland, surrounded by scattered tents and temporary wooden structures. Sea winds swept across the open terrain, carrying the smell of fuel, oil, and mud. The men had trained for years, but nothing could fully prepare them for life in a combat zone. Their beds were canvas cots, their meals often cold, and the constant sound of engines and artillery became the backdrop of their existence. Yet even here, prejudice pursued them. Some bomber crews whispered doubts when they learned their new escorts would be Negro pilots. "We're supposed to trust them with our lives?" one crewman muttered to another. Word spread quickly that many in the 15th Air Force didn't want the 332nd covering their missions. The men at Ramatelli understood the unspoken challenge. They would be judged not on training records, but on whether bombers returned home safely. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr. wasted no time establishing expectations. Standing before his men on their first morning, he spoke with steady authority. "We are here to fight. Every mission you fly, every bullet you fire, reflects on all of us. Remember what you carry into that cockpit. It isn't just ammunition. It's the weight of proving them wrong." His words cut through the haze of doubt. The men knew what was at stake. The first days at Ramatelli were consumed with preparation. Ground crews worked tirelessly to get the P-39 Era Cobras and later P-47 Thunderbolts and P-151 Mustangs combat ready. The aircraft bore fresh red paint on their tails, a marking that initially seemed like a burden. The color was too visible. Pilots worried it made them obvious targets. But soon, the red would come to mean something entirely different. For the men, adjusting to Italy was challenging. Nearby villages were scarred by war, families surviving on little more than bread and olive oil. Local children often gathered near the base perimeter, waving at the pilots, offering smiles in exchange for pieces of chocolate or gum. In those moments, the airmen saw how deeply this war touched even the smallest lives. Many later recalled that these brief encounters reminded them why they fought, not just for American ideals, but for ordinary people caught in the crossfire. Still, the greatest test came in the air. The first missions out of Ramatelli were tense. Imagine climbing into the cockpit, strapping in, hearing the engine roar to life. The Mustang trembled beneath you as the ground crew gave a thumbs up. Ahead, the runway stretched like a narrow path into the unknown. Pilots lined up, engines screaming, and one by one they lifted off into the gray Italian sky. Their task was simple in words, but deadly in execution. protect the bombers at all costs. German fighters had grown expert at tearing apart bomber formations. The B-17s and B-24s lumbered through the air, slow and vulnerable. They carried bombs for Berlin, Vienna, Munich, but without escorts, they were prey for the Luftwaffe. On those early flights, the Tuskegee pilots held formation with precision. Colonel Davis had drilled it into them. Do not chase kills. Do not abandon your post. Guard the bombers. He repeated it like a sacred oath. When German aircraft finally appeared, diving from the sun, the Red Tails moved as one. Their discipline shocked both allies and enemies. The bombers survived, and word began to spread. The 332nd stuck with you when it mattered. Not everyone was convinced at first. Some bomber crews still doubted, dismissing the Red Tails' early successes as luck. But mission by mission, the statistics began speaking louder than prejudice. Fewer bombers were lost on flights guarded by the Red Tails compared to other escort groups. Skepticism turned into curiosity, and curiosity soon grew into respect. At night, after returning from missions, the men of the 332nd gathered around makeshift tables in their tents. They exchanged stories, their faces still marked with oil and exhaustion. Some laughed over close calls. Others sat quietly, staring into their tin cups of coffee, remembering how close death had come that day. For them, Italy wasn't just a battlefield. It was where they would prove to the world and to themselves that they belonged in the skies. The laughter of German pilots still echoed in their minds. Those German men believed the Red Tails would crumble under pressure. But as each mission passed, the cracks began to show in the myth of German invincibility. The Red Tails weren't only surviving, they were excelling. But survival in Italy was only the beginning. The true test came when the 332nd faced their first real combat, the kind of dogfights where a second's hesitation meant flames and twisted metal falling from the sky. The first combat missions flown by the 332nd Fighter Group weren't just military operations, they were trials by fire. Each man who strapped into his cockpit understood he carried more than his own survival. He carried the burden of proving a nation wrong. It began with escort duty. Their orders were straightforward. Guard the heavy bombers of the 15th Air Force. The massive B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators lumbered through the air, bristling with defensive guns, but still vulnerable to swift, predatory German fighters. To the Luftwaffe, these bombers were prime targets. To the Tuskegee Airmen, they were sacred cargo. Picture the scene. High above the Adriatic, the roar of engines filling the cockpit. Oxygen masks tight against weary faces. At 20,000 feet, temperatures plunged well below freezing. Breath crystallized in masks, fingers went numb on control sticks, and the ever-present rattle of flak bursts filled the air with sudden terror. For bomber crews, the sound of escorts sliding into formation was a lifeline. For the Red Tails, the sight of the bombers was a reminder that their mission was bigger than dogfights. The first time they encountered German fighters, the tension was almost tangible. A formation of Messerschmitt Bf 109 swooped in from above, sleek and menacing, their cannons flashing in the sunlight. The bombers tightened ranks, tracers streaking toward the intruders. "Red section, tighten up, protect the bombers," a voice crackled over the radio. The Red Tails didn't hesitate. Their Mustangs dipped and weaved, cutting across the German attack lanes, forcing the enemy to break formation. What struck observers was the discipline. No one peeled off chasing glory, no one abandoned their post. They held the line, staying glued to the bombers even as German planes darted like sharks around them. One pilot later recalled the rush of adrenaline as he lined up his first enemy in the gun sight. He said, "The plane filled the circle, and I squeezed the trigger. Tracers leapt forward, and I saw pieces tear off his wing. The German fighter spiraled downward, smoke trailing across the sky. It was the moment the Red Tails proved they weren't just capable, they were lethal." But victories didn't come without cost. The air was merciless. Anti-aircraft fire tore through formations, ripping holes in wings and fuselages. Pilots watched friends vanish in sudden bursts of flame, sometimes with no parachute drifting behind. Back at Ramatelli, empty bunks told the story of men who hadn't returned. The laughter of enemies, the doubts of allies, none of that mattered to the families who would never see their sons again. What set the Red Tails apart wasn't the absence of loss, but the way they responded to it. Each time they strapped back into their cockpits, they carried the memory of fallen comrades. The grief became fuel, the discipline, their shield. As missions accumulated, the bomber crews began to take notice. At first, some still muttered skepticism, but after returning from mission after mission with fewer losses than they'd grown accustomed to, their tone began to change. One crewman wrote home, "When I see those red tails beside us, I know we're going to make it back. They don't leave us. Not ever." That loyalty became the signature.
At the mess halls and airfields across Italy, whispers began to spread. Those guys with the red tails, they don't mess around. They stick with you. Respect grew slowly at first, then rapidly as more crews returned with their lives thanks to the discipline of Tuskegee's pilots. Back at Ramatelli, evenings were a mix of relief and exhaustion. The men gathered in tents lit by lanterns, trading stories of dogfights. Some spoke with laughter, replaying moments when luck carried them through. Others sat quietly, staring at the canvas walls, replaying the faces of men who didn't come back. It was in those nights that the Red Tails became more than a squadron. They became a brotherhood, forged in fire. But their early victories were just the beginning. For the Luftwaffe, the arrival of disciplined new opponents was a problem. For the Tuskegee Airmen, it was only the start of their battle for respect. But soon, as the missions grew longer and the enemy more desperate, the Red Tails would reach a turning point, a series of battles that would transform them from untested newcomers to legends of the air war. By the summer of 1944, the Red Tails had already flown enough missions to silence the whispers of incompetence. But the real shift, the moment when their reputation began to spread beyond Ramatelli, came in a series of missions where discipline turned the tide. The 15th Air Force was under constant pressure to deliver crippling blows to German industry, oil refineries in Ploesti, factories in Vienna, and rail yards in Munich were prime targets. Each run meant waves of bombers pushing deep into enemy territory, and every mile brought more danger. The Luftwaffe, though weakened by years of war, was still fierce. Their pilots were skilled, many battle-hardened veterans. For the 332nd, these missions would be their true proving ground. On one such day, bomber crews loaded into their B-24 Liberators. The engines roared to life, and the sky filled with the thunder of hundreds of planes. Above them, the Red Tail slid into escort positions. The bomber's job was destruction. The escort's job was survival. For hours, the formations droned north over the Alps, into territory bristling with flak batteries. Black puffs exploded all around, shaking the bombers and rattling nerves. Then on the horizon came the dreaded glint of German fighters. Dozens of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s closed in, their noses flashing as cannons opened fire. Radio chatter erupted. Bomber crews braced for the worst. But the Red Tails moved with a calm precision that stunned those watching. Instead of scattering or breaking formation, they tightened their guard. One German pilot later recalled being shocked at their discipline. These were not the reckless opponents he had been led to expect. In that battle, the Red Tails didn't just protect, they punished. German planes fell from the sky in flames, while the bomber formation pushed through with minimal losses. When the survivors limped back to Italy, the story spread quickly. The 332nd had held their ground when it mattered most. It wasn't a one-time performance. Mission after mission, the pattern repeated. The Red Tails stayed with the bombers. They didn't chase enemy planes halfway across the sky, leaving the heavies exposed. They didn't get distracted by personal glory. They flew like guardians, always circling back, always watching. And the statistics told the truth. Only 27 bombers were lost out of 179 escort missions, an extraordinary record. For bomber crews used to seeing entire squadrons cut to pieces, this was almost miraculous. Trust began to replace doubt. One veteran B-17 pilot later admitted, "We knew if we had the Red Tails, we were coming back." But the turning point wasn't just about victories. It was about perception. For the first time, word spread through the Air Force that the Negro pilots from Tuskegee weren't just competent, they were exceptional. Officers who had once dismissed them now requested their escort. Crews who had scoffed now shook their hands with gratitude after missions. Within the squadron, the mood began to shift too. The weight of constant skepticism had hung heavy on the men during their early months in Italy. Now they carried themselves with quiet pride. They had proven themselves where it mattered, in combat. Still, the cost of that respect was measured in lives. Each mission brought losses. Men didn't return, and their empty bunks at Ramitelli told the story better than any statistic. Funerals were held quickly, often with little more than a salute and a promise to keep fighting. The grief was raw, but it only deepened the group's resolve. One evening, after a particularly brutal mission, a young pilot sat with his head in his hands. "They thought we wouldn't last," he muttered. His comrade placed a hand on his shoulder and replied, "Then we owe it to them, to the ones we lost, to keep proving them wrong." That exchange captured the spirit of the unit. Every man carried not only his own life, but the memory of those who had fallen. By late 1944, the laughter of German pilots was fading. Reports showed their losses mounting against the very men they had once ridiculed. And in American briefings, the name Red Tails carried weight. The turning point had come. From this moment on, the Red Tails weren't simply fighting to prove themselves. They were fighting as recognized equals, trusted with the most dangerous missions, their legend beginning to take shape in the skies above Europe. But the true test of their skill and courage would arrive when they faced Germany's finest, the aces of the Luftwaffe, and the deadly new aircraft designed to turn the war back in Hitler's favor. By the winter of 1944, the Red Tails had already built a reputation as dependable escorts. But the skies over Europe were changing. The Luftwaffe, though battered, was far from beaten. German aces still roamed the skies, flying the sleek Messerschmitt Bf-109s and the rugged Focke-Wulf FW-190s. These were pilots with hundreds of kills to their names, men who had survived years of air combat. Soon the Tuskegee Airmen would be forced to measure themselves against the very best Germany could offer. The first encounters are like storms breaking out of nowhere. The Red Tails would be guiding bombers along their route when suddenly, from high above, tiny black dots would grow into enemy fighters dieting at tremendous speed. Radios filled with clipped commands. "Bandits, 3 o'clock high." In those moments, training took over. One mission over southern Germany stands out in particular. A formation of B-17s lumbered to their target when a swarm of Bf-109s swept in, diving like hawks. The bomber gunners fired wildly, tracers stitching the sky. But the Germans came on fast. Then from the left flank, the Red Tails surged forward. "Stay tight on the bombers," Colonel Davis's voice crackled over the radio. "Don't let them through." The fight exploded in seconds. Mustangs twisted and rolled, chasing Germans through the clouds. One Tuskegee pilot lined up an FW-190, pressed the trigger, and saw smoke billow from the enemy's engine. Another chased a 109 into a steep dive, only to pull back at the last moment as flak bursts erupted below. Discipline kept them alive. Discipline and the knowledge that breaking formation meant leaving the bombers exposed. It was in these battles that the Red Tails earned the respect of even their fiercest critics. A bomber crewman later recalled watching a Mustang with a Red Tail take on 3 Germans at once, darting in and out, buying precious seconds until the bombers could escape the kill zone. He stayed there. He stayed there when it looked impossible. The Germans, for their part, began to notice something unsettling. These American pilots fought differently. They didn't chase recklessly, didn't scatter. They moved like a single body, bound by unspoken rules. And unlike many escort groups, they didn't abandon the bombers once the fight started. That steadiness made them harder to break and more dangerous. But courage alone didn't make the missions easier. The Luftwaffe was desperate, and desperation made them dangerous. On some runs, the sky seemed filled with enemy fighters, wave after wave pressing the attack. Losses came hard. One afternoon, a young pilot named Earl Lane returned to Ramitelli with bullet holes stitched across his wing. He climbed down from the cockpit, his uniform soaked with sweat, and whispered, "I don't know how I made it back." His comrades didn't need to ask. They all knew survival in those battles often came down to seconds. Then came a new threat, the MiG-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. Sleek, fast, and deadly, the jet could outrun anything the Allies had in the air. For bomber crews, the MiG-262 was a nightmare. The moment it appeared, they knew their gunners had little chance of hitting something moving that fast. The Tuskegee pilots understood immediately that their discipline would be tested like never before. The first time a red-tailed pilot spotted a jet, the radio crackled with disbelief. "He's moving like lightning," one man shouted. The Mustang strained as the pilot pushed it to its limits, trying to cut off the angle of attack. Against all odds, the Red Tails managed to down several of these futuristic machines over the course of the war. Their success came from not chasing recklessly, but from teamwork and timing, catching jets when they slowed for attack runs or while climbing back to altitude. At Ramitelli, the tension after these missions was palpable. The men gathered in their tents, replaying every moment in their minds. Some told stories with wide eyes, describing the blur of a jet streaking past. Others sat quietly, drinking coffee from tin cups, grateful simply to be alive.
For every kill they scored, there was the memory of someone who didn't come back. Still, the legend grew. Stories of the Red Tails spread through the ranks of bomber groups across Italy and beyond. Crews began requesting them by name, trusting their discipline more than any statistic could explain. German pilots, once dismissive, now cursed the sight of red tails flashing in the sun. And yet, the fiercest test still lay ahead, escorting bombers deep into the heart of Berlin. The Tuskegee airmen would face the full fury of the Luftwaffe, jets, aces, and endless flak. It was a mission that could cement their place in history or break them forever. But when the call came to escort bombers to Berlin itself, the Red Tails answered, ready to meet the enemy at the very gates of the Reich. By early 1945, the Red Tails were no longer an experiment. They were a proven force. Yet the fight they carried wasn't only against the Luftwaffe. It was also against the stubborn prejudices of their own side, against the idea that Negro pilots lacked the skill or the nerve to stand shoulder to shoulder with white airmen. Every mission they flew was a challenge to that stereotype, and every return to Ramitelli was a chance to rewrite the story. Individual pilots began to emerge as symbols of that fight. Take Roscoe Brown, for instance. Calm under pressure, Brown was one of the first Tuskegee pilots to bring down a German jet. During a mission in March 1945, he spotted an Me-262 lining up to tear through a bomber formation. Instead of panicking, he used his Mustang's speed in a dive, cutting across the jet's path at the right moment. His bursts of fire struck true, and the jet tumbled from the sky. Back at base, Brown downplayed the victory, but among his comrades it was a clear statement: no enemy was untouchable. Or consider Charles Brantley, who nearly didn't make it home from one of his first combat missions. His Mustang took heavy damage from flak, smoke pouring from the engine. Instead of bailing out, he nursed the crippled plane back across miles of enemy territory. When he finally landed at Ramitelli, the aircraft was so shot up it was deemed beyond repair. Brantley stepped out, exhausted but alive, and the ground crew greeted him with stunned admiration. That flight became part of the Red Tails' growing lore, a reminder that survival often came from grit as much as skill. Then there was Earl Lane, whose quick thinking saved not only his own life, but those of an entire bomber crew. On one mission, German fighters slipped past the escort and lined up on a straggling B-17. Lane, flying low and out of position, shoved his Mustang into a steep climb, throwing himself directly in between the bomber and the enemy. He fired furiously,
scattering the Germans long enough for the bomber to limp back into formation. The crew later credited him with their survival. When asked why he took the risk, he simply said, "That's the job." Moments like these began to chip away at the wall of prejudice. At first, white bomber crews had hesitated to put their lives in the hands of the Tuskegee men. But experience is a stubborn teacher. Again and again, the Red Tails returned with bombers intact, even against overwhelming odds. Skepticism turned into respect, and respect into trust. One bomber pilot later recalled, "At first, we weren't sure about them. But after a few missions, we realized they don't leave us. When those Red Tails are with you, you feel like you've got a fighting chance." Back in Italy, the airmen were still treated as second-class soldiers in many ways. They faced segregated facilities, were denied entry into certain officers' clubs, and were often spoken down to by commanders. But up in the air, none of that mattered. Up there, performance was the only language that counted. And by 1945, the Red Tails spoke it fluently. Even German prisoners began to acknowledge their skill. In one documented case, a captured Luftwaffe pilot admitted his surprise when he learned he had been shot down by a Tuskegee airman. "I did not expect such discipline," he reportedly said. That grudging respect carried its own weight, for it showed that even hardened enemies had been forced to reevaluate their assumptions. For the men themselves, the victories were bittersweet. They celebrated, yes, but they also counted the cost. Several pilots had not returned, their planes lost somewhere over Germany. In the mess tent that night, the laughter was muted, the coffee bitter. They had faced the enemy head-on, brought down jets, and earned honor, but they had also left comrades behind. Still, the significance of the day could not be denied. On March 24, 1945, the Tuskegee Airmen had done more than escort bombers. They had faced Germany's finest and proven that courage, discipline, and determination could carry them through the most dangerous mission of the war. The laughter of their enemies was long gone. In its place was silence, respect, and at last, recognition.
But as the war drew to a close, the question remained, what would happen when these men returned home? Would America honor their service, or would the fight for dignity continue long after the guns went quiet? By the spring of 1945, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Years of relentless bombing, fuel shortages, and the constant drain of combat had worn it down to the bone. Yet for the men of the 332nd Fighter Group, every mission still carried danger. Even in the final weeks of the war, flak and desperate enemy fighters claimed lives. But as Germany's defenses crumbled, one thing became clear. The Red Tails had left an imprint on the skies of Europe that no one could ignore. Their record spoke volumes. Over 179 escort missions, they had lost only 27 bombers, a fraction compared to other groups. They had destroyed more than 100 enemy aircraft in the air and even more on the ground in strafing runs. They had downed jet fighters, tangled with aces, and flown into the heart of enemy territory time after time. To bomber crews, their presence meant hope. To German pilots, it meant trouble. The respect they had earned from their fellow airmen was perhaps the most telling change. At the start of their service, many bomber crews had scoffed, asking not to be escorted by the experiment. By the end of the war, the same men were requesting the Red Tails specifically. "If I had the Red Tails, I knew I'd see home again," one bomber pilot said years later. That shift in perception was more than personal. It was cultural. The Tuskegee Airmen had shown that prejudice had no place in the cockpit. At Ramitelli, the men felt the weight of what they had accomplished. In the evenings, they gathered around campfires or in tents, sharing stories of close calls and victories. Some laughed, retelling moments of daring. Others sat quietly, remembering friends who hadn't returned.
Every empty chair was a reminder of the cost of their success. Yet there was also pride. Pride in having met the challenge head-on, in having answered the doubts of both allies and enemies with skill, discipline, and courage. As news spread of Germany's surrender in May 1945, Ramitelli erupted in celebration. Pilots and ground crews alike shouted, embraced, and fired flares into the night sky. The war in Europe was over. For the Red Tails, the relief was immense, but so was the uncertainty of what came next. Many wondered what kind of reception awaited them back home. They had risked their lives, fought bravely, and proven themselves in the most unforgiving of circumstances. Yet they knew the America they would return to was still divided, still stained by segregation and discrimination. The thought weighed heavily on their minds. Would their country see them as heroes, or would it return them to second-class citizenship the moment their uniforms came off? Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. understood that their fight was not finished. He reminded his men that their record was more than just military statistics. It was a weapon against prejudice. They cannot deny what we have done, he told them, and they cannot erase what it means. In the months that followed, the Tuskegee Airmen returned to the United States. Some stayed in the military, others pursued civilian careers. Everywhere they went, they carried the memory of Ramitelli, of the red tails flashing in the sun, of the bond forged in the crucible of war. Their legacy began to spread, though recognition was slow. It would take decades for the full story to be acknowledged, for the nation to honor their service with the medals and tributes they deserved. But among those who had flown with them, the legacy was immediate. Bomber crews told their families of the Negro pilots who never left their side. German veterans spoke grudgingly of opponents who fought with discipline and courage. The Red Tails had proven themselves not just as airmen, but as pioneers who forced open doors that had been closed for generations. By the end of the war, the laughter of German pilots had long been silenced. In its place was the echo of roaring mustangs, the red tails gleaming against the sky, a lasting symbol of determination, unity, and the refusal to be defined by prejudice. But while the skies of Europe had seen their triumph, the battle awaiting them back home would test them in ways no dogfight ever could. When the Tuskegee Airmen returned to the United States after the war, they stepped off the ships and trains with the quiet pride of men who had done their duty. They had fought in the bloodiest skies of Europe, defended bombers with unmatched discipline, and carved out a combat record that rivaled or exceeded many of their peers. But instead of parades and open arms, many found themselves greeted with the same prejudice they had left behind. Signs still marked whites only across restaurants and bus stations. Officers who had earned distinguished flying crosses were still denied entry into certain clubs. The contradiction was jarring. Heroes abroad, yet strangers at home. For many of the airmen, that was the most bitter pill. They had risked everything, not just for survival, but for the hope that their sacrifice would change minds. And in some ways it did. Their record became ammunition in the long fight for civil rights. Newspapers wrote about their heroics, bomber crews spoke publicly about their loyalty, and the military itself began to reconsider the policy of segregation in its ranks. In 1948, President Harry Truman issued Executive Order 9981, formally desegregating the armed forces. The Red Tails didn't just fly missions in Europe. They had cracked the foundation of discrimination in the U.S. military. Still, the impact went beyond policy. For young Black Americans growing up in the shadow of Jim Crow, the story of the Red Tails was a beacon. They were proof that no stereotype could define what a person was capable of. The airmen had faced ridicule, doubt, and systemic obstacles and had answered them with action. Their victories in the air became victories for all who believed that courage and discipline could overcome hate. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. continued to serve, rising to the rank of general. His calm, disciplined leadership became a model not only for military men, but for anyone facing impossible odds. Other Tuskegee pilots went on to careers as educators, judges, engineers, and community leaders, carrying the lessons of Ramitelli into every corner of American life. The moral of their story is as clear today as it was in 1945. Prejudice underestimates, but discipline proves. The German pilots laughed at the thought of facing Negro fighter pilots.
Some American commanders doubted their worth. Even neighbors back home expected them to fail. But every mission flown, every bomber protected, every enemy turned back was a rejection of those lies. The Red Tails showed the world that character is not defined by the color of one's skin, but by the choices one makes under pressure. There's something deeply human in that lesson. We all face voices of doubt, sometimes from others, sometimes from within ourselves. The Tuskegee Airmen remind us that the answer isn't in arguing, but in action. Prove it through consistency. Prove it through loyalty. Prove it by refusing to give up, even when the world tells you that you can't. Their story also carries a warning. Respect isn't given, it's earned, and often at great cost. The Red Tails didn't win their place in history through speeches or slogans. They earned it in the thin, frozen air over Europe, where seconds meant life or death. They didn't break discipline, didn't chase personal glory. They stayed with the bombers again and again, until their record silenced doubt. That kind of commitment is rare, and it's why their legacy still holds power generations later. When we think of the Red Tails today, we don't just think of the red paint on their Mustangs or the statistics in military records. We think of men who faced laughter, mockery, and prejudice, and answered with courage. We think of young cadets in Alabama sweating through impossible training who refused to quit. We think of exhausted pilots at Ramitelli climbing out of battered planes knowing they'd given everything for the men who flew beside them. And we think of the silence in German briefing rooms when the news came and another squadron of Luftwaffe fighters had been lost to the very men they once mocked. The laughter had ended. The respect remained. So what can we take from their story today? Maybe this. When the world doubts you, don't waste your breath on arguments. Put your head down, stay disciplined, and let your actions speak louder than prejudice. The Tuskegee Airmen proved that a steady hand, a loyal heart, and relentless courage can change history. And that is why their legacy lives on, not only in museums and history books, but in every person who faces doubt and chooses to rise above it. If you found yourself moved by the story, if the Red Tails reminded you of the strength that comes from perseverance, then don't let their story fade. Share it. Talk about it. Carry it with you. And if you want to hear more stories of courage, history, and the people who shaped the world, make sure to subscribe. The past is full of lessons worth remembering, and the Red Tails are one of the greatest.